She thought she was smirking at just another passenger with a southern drawl. She had no idea the woman she belittled used to fly the very planes she now serves on. Lorraine Eaton adjusted the strap on her leather carry-on as she stepped onto Flight 842 from Birmingham to Minneapolis. She didn't look like much to most, just another middle-aged black woman traveling solo in wide leg pants, a crisp navy blouse, and low heels. No designer logos, no dramatic flair. But her movements were deliberate, practiced, like someone who knew her way around planes. She found her seat, 3C, aisle, near the front of the cabin, tucked her bag under the seat, and sat with a long exhale. Her mind wasn't on peanuts or seat belts. She had a meeting tomorrow morning with a partner from Germany who flew in just for one thing, to renegotiate a contract worth $1.2 billion. Lorraine needed sleep, not small talk. As passengers settled in, a blonde flight attendant moved down the aisle, checking bags and giving overly cheerful greetings. Her name tag read, Chelsea Reed. She paused when she reached Lorraine's row. "Hello there," Chelsea said, then hesitated. "Oh, you're in the right seat? Good." Lorraine raised an eyebrow at the odd comment but said nothing. She'd seen this before, people assuming she couldn't possibly belong in business class. She let it go. At her age, you pick your battles. 10 minutes later, as the plane leveled off and the drink service began, Lorraine leaned forward when Chelsea approached. "Could I get some sparkling water, please?" Lorraine asked, her voice smooth with a soft southern lilt. She didn't drag her words, didn't raise her tone, just spoke how she always did. Chelsea blinked. "Sparkling water?" she repeated, drawing out the vowels and giving a little chuckle. "You mean like club soda?" Lorraine nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am." Chelsea's smile twisted, then tightened. She poured the drink, handed it over without making eye contact, and moved on. It was quick, subtle, but it had a sharp edge. The man in the aisle seat behind Lorraine looked up, his face unreadable. The woman across from her, a younger white passenger with earbuds in, raised her eyes briefly, then looked away. Lorraine sipped her drink calmly. She'd seen that look 1,000 times, heard that tone dressed in 100 variations. It wasn't about her words, it was about her voice, her accent, the way her mouth wrapped around vowels and carried a Georgia rhythm. It was the kind of moment most folks would let pass. A little smirk, a little laugh. Easy to ignore. But Lorraine hadn't spent decades building a life out of nothing just to be laughed at mid-flight. Still, she said nothing, because Lorraine Eaton wasn't there to make a scene. She was there to close a deal the next morning that would shift the entire structure of a global logistics chain, and she didn't need to explain herself to a flight attendant on the way. She pulled out her tablet and opened up the latest spreadsheet from the Frankfurt team. Numbers calmed her. Logic didn't snicker. Chelsea returned with snacks. "Would you like almonds or pretzels?" she asked, sing-song voice back in place. "Almonds, please," Lorraine replied evenly. "Sure thing," Chelsea said, then glanced sideways, clearly avoiding direct eye contact. "Let me know if you need anything else." Lorraine took the almonds, gave a polite smile, and watched her walk away. 2 rows behind, a little boy asked his mom loudly, "Why was that lady laughing at the woman with the short hair?" The mother hushed him. "She wasn't laughing at her, honey. People just talk different sometimes." The boy wasn't convinced. "She was mean." Lorraine heard every word. She didn't turn. She just tucked the almonds into her bag and returned to her work. Her hands were steady, because Lorraine had long learned that some lessons don't need to be taught immediately. Some are better served cold, in silence, with patience. But the sky has a way of revealing more than just clouds. The flight moved on like any other. The hum of the engines steadied, passengers settled into their screens or snacks, and the crew kept moving through the narrow aisle like clockwork. Lorraine didn't look up from her tablet much, except when a crying baby a few rows back tugged at her focus. Chelsea came around again mid-flight to collect trash. This time, her demeanor had shifted. More clipped, less chirpy. "Trash?" she asked, holding out the bag toward Lorraine. Lorraine held out her empty cup and napkin without a word. Chelsea took them, gave a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes, and turned away. But just as she passed, Lorraine caught it. A whisper under Chelsea's breath. Not loud, not clear, but just enough. Gotta love that southern syrup. Lorraine didn't flinch, but her eyes flicked up sharply. She wasn't imagining it. From across the aisle, the young white woman who'd noticed earlier, mid-20s maybe, dark blazer, nose ring, looked over. This time she didn't look away. Lorraine met her eyes. There was no exchange of words, just something quiet and understood. A brief acknowledgement between two strangers who both saw the same thing. Chelsea returned again 20 minutes later, this time passing out immigration forms for those with connecting international flights. She barely glanced at Lorraine. "Don't think you'll be needing this," she said, pulling the stack away before Lorraine could even respond. That was enough. Lorraine closed her tablet. She glanced around. Most passengers were too buried in movies or headphones to notice the subtle digs. That's the thing about quiet cruelty. It hides in the spaces between words. But a few did notice. A man across the aisle in a burgundy golf shirt leaned slightly forward. "Excuse me," he said to Lorraine, voice low. Did she just say something rude?" Lorraine offered a half smile. "Let's just say she's making assumptions." He nodded once. "Well, that's not right." Lorraine didn't respond. She didn't need backup. But she wasn't alone in the noticing anymore. And that mattered. The air grew thicker as the flight continued. Chelsea had shifted from cold to avoiding entirely. No more glances, no more casual checks. She didn't even pause near Lorraine's row again. Instead, a younger attendant, a brunette with a soft voice and the name tag Becca, stopped by after a while. "Hi there," Becca said with a kind expression. "Just checking in. Can I bring you anything else? We've got ginger ale, sparkling cider, even coffee if you'd like." Lorraine considered her for a second. "Sparkling cider would be lovely. Thank you." Becca smiled warmly. "You got it." She returned with the drink in under a minute. No hesitation, no comments, just respect. Across the aisle, the young woman leaned in a little. "I just wanted to say, I heard her too," she said. "You handled it better than most would have." Lorraine looked at her, not with surprise, but with a calm curiosity. "You from the South?" she asked. "Mississippi. Moved to Des Moines last year," the woman replied. Lorraine gave a small nod. "Then you know. Folks think it's slow talk, but it's sharp when it needs to be," the woman smiled. "Exactly." They didn't need to say more. The interaction wasn't loud. It didn't escalate. But it shifted something in the cabin. People noticed how Lorraine held herself, how she didn't stoop, didn't react. And that restraint? It carried power. Because silence used right can be louder than shouting. Chelsea walked by again later, head turned. Not even a glance. Lorraine calmly took another sip of her drink, opened her planner, and made a few notes. Flight schedules, gate changes, names of regional executives. She knew what was waiting at the airport, and she had no intention of shrinking herself before it. But sometimes the storm brews quietly before the lightning strikes. Cruising at 34,000 feet, Lorraine leaned her head back and let her eyes close, just for a moment. She wasn't sleeping, her mind rarely let her, but she drifted into the quiet place she always visited on long flights, a place where memory came without invitation. In her early 30s, Lorraine had worn the same uniform Chelsea did now, navy blazer, wingpin, polished shoes, but in a much different role. She wasn't there to serve drinks. She was flying the damn plane. Back then, commercial airlines weren't exactly rolling out the welcome mat for black women in cockpits. She got used to the double takes, the long pauses when she stepped onto a flight deck and introduced herself as first officer. Sometimes it was the passengers, sometimes the captains. Occasionally, even the flight attendants would squint, like they'd misheard her. Her first job was with SunWest Regional. The routes were small, Tallahassee to Mobile, Baton Rouge to Little Rock. But they were real. She flew through thunderstorms, rerouted over hurricanes, landed on icy runways in Montana with barely a whisper of ground crew to help. Her very first captain, a man named Walter Lindstrom, took one look at her during training and said, "You're going to have to be twice as good, Eaton, just to get half the respect." He was right, but Lorraine didn't argue. She just worked. She logged flight hours, learned the mechanics, memorized emergency procedures inside and out. When other co-pilots stumbled under pressure, she stayed steady. Cool, always calm. The stories she could tell, like the time an engine failed mid-air outside of Kansas City. Lorraine was the one who stayed on the radio, coordinated the landing, and even calmed down a panicked flight attendant mid-turbulence. The captain shook her hand after the flight and muttered, "Never doubted you." He had. But she didn't need the apology. When she finally made captain herself, Lorraine celebrated alone, bought herself a new pair of gold earrings, and drove out to a seafood shack in Biloxi. Nobody toasted her. No champagne. Just her and a grilled catfish plate. But that meal tasted like triumph. Over the years, she started flying international. Bigger planes, heavier cargo. Eventually, a headhunter approached her about a leadership role in logistics. Less flying, more strategy. She resisted at first. Flying had become part of her, but she saw the ceiling. She knew how far the cockpit would take her, and how far it wouldn't. So she stepped out of the jet bridge and into boardrooms. She didn't miss the early wake-up calls or the long-haul layovers, but she missed the sky, the weightlessness, the silence. Now, sitting on this flight, just another passenger again, she could feel the difference. She wasn't in uniform. No one called her captain. She was just a woman in 3C with a soft drawl and a target on her back, whether Chelsea Reed realized it or not. But that was the thing. Chelsea didn't know. She had no clue that the woman she'd mocked had over 9,000 logged flight hours, that she'd flown more miles than most of the pilots on this plane, that she'd commanded entire fleets of aircraft and signed off on billion-dollar cargo deals. To Chelsea, Lorraine was just a passenger, one with a funny voice, a soft-spoken older woman who didn't look the part. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so familiar. Lorraine opened her eyes again and glanced out the window. The clouds below looked soft, distant, like memory. She smiled to herself, just barely, because the longer Chelsea kept underestimating her, the heavier her silence became. Lorraine didn't need to defend herself. Life had already written her resume, but the past has a funny way of preparing you for the present. The wheels screeched gently against the runway as Flight 842 landed in Minneapolis. The soft bump stirred a few sleeping passengers awake. Lorraine remained motionless, her hands folded in her lap. She always observed landings carefully, old habits from the cockpit, listening to the engines wind down, judging the angle, feeling the braking. The seatbelt sign chimed off. "Welcome to Minneapolis," the pilot's voice came over the speaker. "Local time is 3:17 p.m. Please remain seated until the aircraft comes to a complete stop at the gate." Lorraine reached for her bag but didn't stand. She waited. Chelsea appeared again, moving up the aisle, plastering on that practiced smile, the smile that seemed fine from a distance. But up close, it had cracks. She avoided Lorraine's eyes as she passed, checking overhead bins, motioning for passengers to remain seated. And then, right as the door opened and the first few rows began to deplane, Chelsea returned. She knelt slightly next to Lorraine's seat, voice low, expression tighter now. "Hi, I just wanted to say if anything I said earlier came off as, offensive or anything, I didn't mean it that way. I was just joking. Some people are sensitive." Lorraine looked at her squarely. The words hung there. "Some people are sensitive." Chelsea fidgeted, clearly expecting some form of reassurance. Lorraine didn't blink. "I don't recall laughing with you." Chelsea's face froze. She opened her mouth slightly as if to respond, then thought better of it. Well, anyway, have a good rest of your day," she said quickly, backing up. Lorraine stood slowly. "You too." A few nearby passengers heard it. One raised an eyebrow, another gave a look, not of pity, but respect. As Lorraine stepped into the aisle, she noticed Becca, the younger attendant from earlier, standing near the galley. Their eyes met briefly. Becca said softly, "Thank you." Lorraine gave her a nod, this time a real one. A quiet acknowledgement. As she moved toward the door, she noticed Chelsea standing near the captain, whispering something behind her hand. The captain, an older man with graying hair and a sun-worn face, looked over at Lorraine. His expression was unreadable. Then, as Lorraine reached the jet bridge, she heard him speak to Chelsea behind her. "Next time, keep the jokes to yourself." Chelsea didn't answer. Outside the gate, Lorraine stepped into the terminal with purpose. She checked the time, 3:24 p.m. Still had 2 hours until her meeting with the team from Brussels. Plenty of time to decompress. She headed toward the Delta Sky Club, walking past the crowds, her heels tapping steadily on the tile. Inside the lounge, cool air and calm lighting replaced the noise of the concourse. Lorraine walked to the reception desk and gave her name. The attendant smiled brightly. "Miss Eaton, welcome back." As Lorraine entered, 2 pilots sitting near the bar looked up and stood quickly. One of them, a tall black man in his early 50s, stepped forward. "Lorraine?" he said with surprise. "Well, I'll be. Didn't know you were flying today." "I try to keep a low profile these days," Lorraine replied with a small smile. "Please, you taught half of us how to land in crosswinds. Don't act like we forgot." He hugged her, and the other pilot followed with a handshake. Moments later, a regional executive for the airline joined them, a woman in a navy pantsuit who clearly knew Lorraine well. They chatted briefly, catching up like old friends. Lorraine didn't look around for Chelsea. She didn't have to, because just as she took a seat and sipped the espresso offered to her, she caught the smallest shift in the air. Chelsea had entered the lounge. Her voice, loud and friendly just seconds ago, dropped immediately. Lorraine didn't even look up. But she knew. She could feel it. Chelsea stood near the entrance, frozen, eyes fixed on the circle of uniformed pilots and executives gathered around the very woman she'd written off as a nobody 2 hours earlier. It was the look of someone who'd just realized she'd messed up. Not because she'd been caught, but because now everyone in that room knew who Lorraine Eaton really was. But what Chelsea didn't know was that the real turbulence hadn't even started yet. Chelsea Reed stood near the coffee station, pretending to stir sugar into an empty cup. Her hands moved, but her mind wasn't focused on coffee. She kept glancing toward the far side of the lounge where Lorraine sat, surrounded by people in navy and charcoal suits, laughing in low tones, trading updates, handshakes, and inside jokes. Chelsea didn't recognize most of them, but that didn't matter. The insignias on their jackets, the airline pins, and the way others glanced at Lorraine as they passed, said everything. These weren't just casual travelers, these were insiders, pilots, executives, people who made decisions and signed checks. And Lorraine? She wasn't trying to prove anything. She wasn't raising her voice or puffing her chest. She was simply there, in the middle of it all, completely at ease. Chelsea stood stiff, stuck in place. She finally turned away, heart pounding, cheeks hot. She hadn't known. She had no idea who Lorraine was when she'd chuckled at her voice, when she'd mumbled her little comments. And now? She felt the heat of her own embarrassment spreading through her collarbones. Becca appeared at her side. "Didn't realize Ms. Eaton was on our flight," she said, sipping her drink. Chelsea kept her eyes down. "Who?" Becca gave her a look. "Lorraine Eaton. You know who she is, right?" Chelsea forced a shrug. "Not really. Just some passenger, I guess." Becca blinked. "She's on the board for North Sky Aviation, flew for 20 years, helped design half the cargo routing systems we use. You might want to Google her before your next shift." Chelsea swallowed hard. "Didn't realize." Becca didn't smile. "You should have." Lorraine glanced their way. Not for long, not with malice, just a single brief acknowledgement, enough to remind Chelsea that she'd seen her, heard her, and remembered. Lorraine turned back to her conversation. A tall woman in a dark red blouse walked up to her table, a regional HR director from the airline. She shook Lorraine's hand, handed her a folder, and said something Chelsea couldn't hear. Then they both laughed, relaxed. Chelsea stood there, small. She wasn't used to feeling this way. On flights, she had power, authority, a uniform that earned automatic respect. But now, she was just an employee who'd shown poor judgment in front of the wrong person. She debated walking over, saying something, explaining, but what would she say? Sorry I mocked your accent because I thought you were beneath me. That wouldn't go well. And Lorraine didn't look like she was interested in hearing excuses. Still, after a few moments, she walked over slowly, awkward, out of place. She approached as one of the pilots stepped away to answer a call, leaving a narrow opening at the table. Lorraine saw her coming. Chelsea cleared her throat. Hi again, Ms. Eaton. Lorraine tilted her head slightly. Yes? Chelsea tried to keep her voice steady. I just wanted to say, I didn't know who you were earlier. If I'd known... Lorraine raised a hand calmly. Stop right there. Chelsea blinked. Lorraine's tone wasn't angry. It was even, steady, controlled. Don't apologize because you found out I'm somebody, Lorraine said. Apologize because you were disrespectful to someone you thought was nobody. Chelsea froze. The other pilot at the table shifted slightly in his seat. The HR director didn't look up, but her pen paused over the folder she was reviewing. Lorraine continued. You don't need to know someone's resume to treat them with decency. I don't need your regret. I needed your respect. On that flight, when you thought I didn't matter. Chelsea opened her mouth, then closed it. There wasn't much to say. She looked down. You're right, she whispered. Lorraine nodded once. Now you know. Chelsea turned and walked away without another word. The lounge didn't stop. No one clapped. But those who overheard said nothing either, and somehow that silence felt heavier than applause. Lorraine sipped her coffee. She didn't need revenge. She had her peace. But humiliation is loudest when it's earned in silence. Lorraine remained at the table, flipping through the folder the HR director had given her. It held notes on fleet performance, updated routing schedules, and a proposal draft for an international freight hub expansion. Nothing surprising, but enough to keep her mind steady. Numbers kept her grounded, especially after emotional noise tried to pull her off course. She glanced up as Becca approached the table. Ms. Eaton, Becca said gently. Sorry to interrupt, I just wanted to thank you for how you handled that back there. Lorraine looked at her, eyes softening. You did just fine too, Becca. I noticed. Becca gave a small smile. A few of us did. Things like that happen more than they should. People notice. Most of us just never know what to say. Lorraine tapped her fingers lightly against her coffee cup. Silence is easy. Speaking takes risk. But both send messages. Becca nodded slowly, then straightened. Well, I just wanted to say I learned something today. From you. You'll be in charge someday, Lorraine said plainly. Remember how this felt. And when you are, make sure the ones who think they're invisible get seen. Becca left, her posture a little taller. Lorraine turned back to her folder, but a voice interrupted her again. This time, low and familiar. You always did know how to level a room with a sentence. Lorraine looked up and grinned. Morgan. The former chief operations officer of North Sky leaned against the table, holding a ginger ale, his airline badge still clipped to his belt. Word travels fast, he said, lowering himself into the empty seat beside her. Half the crew in here already knows what happened on that flight. Lorraine sighed. Wasn't trying to make a spectacle. You didn't. You handled it the way you always have. With control. Seth tilted his head slightly. But I got to ask. How do you keep your cool with people like that? Lorraine thought for a moment. You ever hear someone say, don't wrestle with pigs because you'll get dirty and they'll like it? Seth laughed. Sure have. That's how I see it, she said. I'm not going to drag myself through the mud just to prove something to someone who never thought I belonged in the first place. Seth looked at her like he always did, with admiration. You ever think about coming back to the flight side? There's a few captains who'd love to have you in a simulator again. Lorraine chuckled. I've traded jump seats for boardrooms, but I keep the license current, just in case. Their conversation faded into quieter talk about mutual colleagues, upcoming contracts, shifts in fuel strategy. But across the lounge, Chelsea sat alone in a corner, her shoulders tight, her phone untouched. She wasn't scrolling. She wasn't texting. She was just sitting, still, probably wondering how much of the story would follow her. Whether this would make its way back to her supervisor, whether she'd be spoken to, written up, or just remembered in silence. Sometimes consequences don't arrive with announcements. They slip in quietly and stay longer than shame. Becca passed her once on the way to the kitchen. No glance, no smile, nothing. That was worse than a confrontation. That was ice. Lorraine, meanwhile, stood and gathered her folder. She made her way to the exit, not with haste, not with arrogance, just steady steps. Several people nodded as she passed. A pilot opened the door for her. An older woman in a maintenance uniform whispered, I saw you. Thank you. Lorraine paused at the lounge door, just for a second, and looked over her shoulder. Chelsea was still in the corner, still quiet, still waiting on a world that would never quite see her the same way again. Lorraine didn't wave, didn't smile. She walked out. And that was the end of it. But real power never raises its voice. It just shows up. Lorraine's shoes clicked softly against the terminal floor as she made her way toward the private meeting room near Concourse. Her gait was easy, shoulders relaxed, chin high, not in pride, but in clarity. She didn't need the day to go viral. She didn't need apologies wrapped in nervous smiles. What she needed, what she always aimed for, was consistency. A way of moving through the world that didn't bend for small minds. She paused at a window facing the tarmac, watching a crew unload cargo from a 737. The rhythm, the teamwork, the quiet coordination. It reminded her of early mornings and long layovers, of walking across rain-slick ramps with headsets on, sleeves rolled up. She missed it sometimes. Not the fatigue, but the focus, the clarity of a task. A woman passed by, maybe late 20s, curly brown hair, business dress a bit too big in the shoulders. She looked tired, new, like she was still figuring things out. She did a double take when she saw Lorraine, paused, then walked back. Excuse me, the woman said, nervous. Are you Lorraine Eaton? Lorraine smiled, just faintly. Depends. Who's asking? The woman laughed awkwardly. I heard what happened. My uncle works in corporate. I just started as a logistics assistant here. I'm trying to move into ops one day. Well, you've already taken your first step, Lorraine said. You spoke up. The woman blinked. Sorry? You didn't let uncertainty keep you quiet. That's the first step toward leadership. The younger woman exhaled, shoulders dropping. Thanks. People like me, we don't always see a path. You know? I do, Lorraine said. But sometimes, when there isn't a path, you build one. She gave a short nod and walked away, leaving the woman standing there, thinking harder than she had all day. By the time Lorraine reached the meeting room, 2 regional directors were already waiting. Charts were up. Coffee was poured. Everyone stood when she entered, not out of protocol, but respect. Good to see you, Ms. Eaton, one of them said. She took her seat at the head of the table. Let's get to work. Somewhere across the airport, Chelsea was back in uniform, prepping for her next turnaround flight. The silence from her supervisor hadn't lasted. A quick debrief had followed. Nothing official, but enough to make her sweat. She knew eyes would be on her now. Her attitude would be measured. Her tone would matter. Maybe she'd be more careful next time. Maybe not. But Lorraine Eaton? She wouldn't wait around to find out. People often think power is loud, that it thunders into rooms, demands attention, makes scenes. But Lorraine had learned long ago that the most dangerous kind of power doesn't announce itself. It just moves, calmly, confidently, without apology. And maybe that was the real takeaway. For the people watching on that flight, in that lounge, in that meeting room. Maybe that was the lesson. don't underestimate the quiet ones. Don't assume someone's worth based on how they speak, or dress, or where they sit. Because the woman with the soft drawl and calm eyes, she might be the one who signs your paycheck next quarter. So, the next time you feel that smirk rising, pause. Ask yourself, is the joke worth the regret? Because some lessons don't arrive as lectures. They arrive as people. People who don't need to prove anything, because their entire life already has. If this story moved you, share it. And remember, true strength never looks down on others. It just keeps rising. Subscribe for more real human stories that remind us who we are and who we can be.